Been looking forward to this, and I've heard many people are. I wanted to introduce Scott for everybody who doesn't know him. We say he's so young and he even has little kids in elementary school. So we're glad to have Scott. He's been a real blessing to the Lancaster Stamp Club and to the Lebanon Stamp Club, doing just a lot of things for both. He not only edits the Lancaster newspaper, but the Lebanon newsletter as well. And you've seen the format and how nicely that's improved things. He's been organizing and adding programs for the Lancaster Lebanon schedule, and he's on our schedule and has another one he's been talking about for next year. But he has been really an asset to the program. He has areas of hyperinflation, as you know, but Germany, rationing, and I think that one of the car registrations and some of those, anything to do with taxes and things like that. What else do you collect, Scott?
You pretty much covered my major interests.
Yeah, and baseball.
Yeah,
He's doing
definitely.
some presentations on that. So again, we're glad to have you. And you did say that people can have questions along the way or hold them till the end.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then, without further ado, with this, please join me in welcoming Scott to tonight's program on the hyperinflation issues of Germany. So we'll mute, and Scott, it's yours.
Okay, thank you. This is my presentation. Do you see the presentation?
Yeah.
Yep. Yes.
You're good. Yep, it's working.
I've got you're muted for some. Hang on. I've got you muted. Somehow I muted all. Now I can't find the unmute.
I unmuted myself. Can you hear me now?
Oh, okay. Okay, good.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah. This is my presentation on the German hyperinflation and the hyperinflation in Eastern Europe. I deliberately chose this $10 trillion dollar German railway note as a metaphor to illustrate it, because by November of 1923, inflation was spiraling out of control, and Germany had to take the drastic step of actually creating a new currency. This is my disclaimer. There are a lot of scholarly works on this subject. I don't pretend that this presentation is one of them, but I hope that you are both entertained and walk away with a better understanding and appreciation for the stamps and for the time that the German people went through in this period. The interwar years of 1918 and 1913, Germany wasn't the only country that struggled with inflation. Most of Europe did, to varying degrees. They attempted to print more money to reconstruct their countries, and sometimes most people were on the gold standard back then, and sometimes they just didn't. They ran out of gold and they just printed money, the money they needed. I think it's important to define what the hyperinflation is, and I'll read this entire footnote. Columbia University economist Philip Kagan drew the line between inflation and hyperinflation at an inflation rate of 50% per month, and compounding that comes out to 12,875% per year. And this all occurred during the Weimar Republic. The official dates for the Weimar Republic that I found were just before the armistice on November 9th, 1918, through March 23rd, 1933. And that's when the Nazis got control of the German government. This cover illustrated here is a first day cover for those German National Assembly stamps. They were issued in July of 1919. And that's the National Assembly took place at Weimar, and that's why they call this era the Weimar Republic. They drew up a new constitution there. An overly simplified account. Basically, it went The inflation in Germany began during the war. When they lost the war, they were subject to the payment of reparations as a condition of the Treaty of Versailles. France and Britain both demanded that Germany repay them in gold, and they didn't have enough gold to do that, so they basically exhausted their reserves and did what most countries do. They just started printing more and more paper money, and their economy was also put under strain because they lost a lot of productive territory. When they couldn't pay the reparations, some territories, particularly in the Rhine and the Ruhr region, were occupied by France and Belgium, and it didn't help their economy at all. So the average exchange rate of the German mark was about 5 to 1 before the war in 1913, and in early 1923 it was 400 to 1. And this is a table from that book that I had illustrated at the beginning of the presentation. As you can see, it's about a trillion times. The mark inflated about a trillion times from where it was in July of 1914. It was just an amazing time. Germany tried to carry on their financial business. You can find old bonds. This bond was issued in 1922 with a denomination of 100,000 marks, and it was intended to pay dividends of 2,500 marks biannually for 10 years. But by the end of the year after this bond was issued, it was worthless. So 4 of these 1 trillion mark notes were worth less than this US dollar. And as a note, if you're interested in collecting banknotes, the ones that are denominated in trillion, which is actually, it says billion in Germany, but billion, the word for billion was milliarden. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but billion actually means trillion, and these are the only ones that you'll have to pay more than $50 for, because all the other notes, they're just around in such quantity that they're not scarce at all. So this is a important book if you want to understand the conditions that kind of brought about the inflation. It was written by John Maynard Keynes. A lot of us recognize his name because he became one of the best known economists of the last century. He was actually a delegate to Britain's contingent to the treaty, but he became frustrated with how things were going and quit. And when he went back, he wrote this book. And he basically argued that there was no way that Germany was ever going to be able to repay their debt, their war debt, and become productive members of society under the conditions that they were put under. So this illustration is it's a really good recent biography of Keynes if anybody's interested in learning more about him. He's best known for his work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And basically the theory went, in order to get out of a recession or a depression, which the world was in the 1930s, government should spend money to help provide their citizens with a paycheck and to be able to work productively. And in the United States, the Works Progress Administration was an example of that, when the federal government hired people to build schools and other things to give them a job, give them employment. And this is what I call my idea for a topical or thematic collection of stamps from World War II, philatelic consequences of the peace. I'll show you a few of those. Upper Silesia was one. These stamps are common. There was a plebiscite which was being advertised on the top stamp in 1921. I got a lot of mine from big lots of German stamps, but I actually bought a collection of Polish stamps one time, and there were a bunch of these. There were also a bunch of the ones in the bottom. There's a Polish stamp with a coal miner, and he's called the Silesian miner. And for all you Cinderella collectors out there, this is a propaganda label that Germany was issuing prior to the vote. It's not a genuine Polish stamp, although it's made to look like one. And it basically exhorted the voter to choose Germany when they're voting. And the voters did overwhelmingly choose to be a part of Germany, but Poland protested, and they were allowed to keep the eastern third of the region of Upper Silesia, and that was the third that had was richest in the coal deposits and all those other things. So they were basically celebrating that with this stamp here, and there was a whole series of these with the Silesian miner. And this is a piece of something called not geld, also emergency money, and it'll illustrate my next area, Memel. Memel land was an area of East Prussia that Germany lost during the war. This one was issued in Tilsit, and I actually tried to translate these words here, but I don't know what I did with the paper, so I won't be able to do that for you. But it's basically it shows Tilsit in Germany and East Prussia on this side of the river, and Memel on the other side of the river. And there were several different stamp issues. First, they overprinted common Germania stamps with Memel which means, or Memel which means Memel territory. There were also French stamps that were overprinted for use in the territory. And ultimately, Memel became part of the Klaipėda region of Lithuania, and I believe this is an overprinted Lithuanian stamp here. After they had overprinted these stamps, Memel actually had their own stamps. Here are some Polish stamps from the time. Again, a lot of the early Polish stamps were overprinted stamps of other countries. In the top, we have from Germany. On the bottom, we have from Austria. Czechoslovakia, and these are overprinted stamps. The top one was from Hungary. The bottom one is from Austria. You definitely, especially lesser experienced collectors, really need to watch out when they're buying these stamps for the overprints, because the overprints might not be genuine. A lot of you all are experienced in that and probably realize that, but I actually saw a set of these stamps recently on eBay go for almost $200, because apparently there was a bidding war for them. And I don't know what they're worth, even if the overprints are genuine, but a lot of the stamps from this era are so available unused that it probably wouldn't be hard for a forger to forge them. The Saar was an area between Germany and France. I think it was on the eastern part of Germany with the border of France. At the beginning, they used overprinted German stamps until they started issuing their own designs. And the condition of the treaty was the Saar could, in 15 years, could take up a vote whether they wanted to become part of Germany again. And after 15 years, they decided to join Germany. And that's the subject of this stamp at the bottom of the page. It's the motto on it says, "The Saar has come home," and you can see the child, the Saar, in the arms of its mother again, Germany. So I know you're all muted, but does anybody have any questions to this point on anything that I went over or that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, Scott, I'll mention something. When I was at APS in one of the expediting courses, we had a fellow who collected Germany, and he was talking about this forgeries and things, and to the point where if it's a pricey stamp, you should have it expertized in Germany. So for what that's worth. because everybody had little printers and they're easy to do.
Mm-hmm.
Good point. I think keep us on our toes.
Yeah, well, that advice is worth a lot. Luckily, the stamps of the inflation period, unless they're used, aren't worth a whole lot.
Right.
So, but some of these are. This is a
Scott,
stamp. Yes.
was it just Germany, or were countries like Austria, Hungary also affected by this as part of the peace plan?
Yes. Yeah, they were infected by infected. I'm sorry.
No,
They
no,
were
no.
affected by the peace plan, the treaty, and the they
Hyperinflation.
all experienced inflation, and I'll touch upon them a little bit later in the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome, Don. So yeah, this is from one of Danzig's first issue stamp. I didn't. Their first stamps were actually again overprinted Germanias, and I think you've probably seen enough of them. But their first issue of stamps all had ships on them. I think they're really beautiful stamps. This is a 5 mark. The highest denomination was a 10 mark, but they were issued in 1921. Danzig also has postal history connections to Poland as a condition of the Treaty of Reverse Sales. Danzig was a part of Germany from the earliest days of the Reich Post, so you can find 19th century German stamps with Danzig cancels on them. But as a condition of the treaty, they were made a free state, and Poland was actually provided access to the port, that was there. And they established their own post offices, and you can find overprinted Poland stamps, Port Gdansk. And to this day, they fell under German control during the war again, when German was overrunning the areas, trying to take back what they lost, and that's what the bottom stamp there is all about. It's another commemorative stamp. This one celebrating Danzig's return. You can see the coat of arms in between the 6 and the tower of this. This is the Cathedral of St. Mary, which is also in Danzig, along with some other scenes here. But today, Danzig is part of Poland, and it's called Gdansk. This is a stamp from the Allenstein plebiscite. There wasn't really a town or a country called Allenstein. This is actually just a German stamp that was overprinted with a notice. And they're really neat because they have the Treaty of Versailles in French. There's 2 varieties. There's this one that kind of has the oval on it, and there's another one that's just overprinted with the words plebiscite, Olsztyn, Allenstein. Olsztyn was the Polish word for Allenstein, and Allenstein was the German. 98% of the city's inhabitants ended up voting to remain a part of Germany. And there was Marion Werder. Their plebiscite vote was held on the same day as Allenstein, and they also voted to remain with Germany, but this was also an area that was contested by both Poland and Germany. And the bottom stamp here is kind of like a unique design for that area. The top stamp is overprinted German stamp. So let's see. So the last philatelic consequence I'll point out is the rise of the Nazi Party. The stamp that's illustrated was issued to commemorate a coup. It was when Adolf Hitler tried to and his group tried to overthrow the Weimar government. And we all know what happened to him. He was charged, tried, and found guilty, but he only spent a short time in prison, during which time he wrote his infamous manifesto. And when this stamp was issued 12 years later, he was in charge of the government. So one of the things that it's interesting, but it's also you know, disturbing at times. Hitler used a lot of stamps, and the Nazis used a lot of their stamps as propaganda. So I thought we'd take a little break from stamps and talk a little bit about film. This is a list of the top 10 silent films from a well-known website, and two of them, number 5, Nosferatu, and number 8, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, are in the top 10. Those films were both produced during the Weimar Republic and the early inflation era. There was a famous book, at least famous to film studies people. It was called From Caligari to Hitler: A Psychological History of German Film. It was written by a German film critic after the war, and in it he posits or proposes a link between the themes in Weimar cinema and the rise of German totalitarianism. And I won't get into it. There are a lot of really neat videos on YouTube about this subject if you're interested. But his theories are a little bit controversial or whatever, but they definitely fit into a box. If you know what I'm trying to say. The first film that I'll talk about was one of the earliest. It was called The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's a really dark film. It has a pretty stunning and extreme plot twist at the end. And it's known as perhaps the finest example of German expressionist cinema, which is defined as an artistic movement that emphasized the artist's inner emotions rather than attempt to replicate reality. The visual distortions and hyper excessive performances that mark this genre of film are present, and you can even see it on this poster. This is just pretty much a distorted picture of a bridge and a light, and the doctor's back there commanding his somnambulist to murder this woman. It's really interesting. I own all of these films, but I watched one on YouTube so far, and I'm guessing a lot of them are on there if anybody's interested in checking any of them out. This film is known by a lot of people as well, Nosferatu. It's basically Dracula just retold, and it's a story of a count who sucks the life out of other humans being by night. And it's directed by a guy named Murnau, and he has another film that I'm going to show you. This film may not have existed because he lost a court battle. All the copies of the film were ordered to be destroyed, but there were films that were no longer in Germany. I think they found one in South America. They might have found one in America that actually were survived, and it's very well preserved in this edition. I am not by any means a horror movie film, but this is just a fascinating film because to me it's like a perfect nightmare. You know, if you really want to spook yourself out, stay up at 2 a.m. and watch it sometime. This is a banknote from the same year that film was made, and it's called the Vampire Note. Some people imagine there's some shading here. I don't personally see it, but there's some shading on this young man's neck that some people think looks like the shadow of a vampire sucking the life's blood out of him. And I can give you an economic note about this. It's a 10,000 mark note. When it was issued early in 1922, it would have bought 250 pounds of meat. But by the end of 1922, with inflation being what it would have only bought about 5 pounds. So it lost value quickly. This is a film called The Golem. I also really like this one. It's not in the top 10, but it's in the Silent Era's top 100, and it's known as an early example of that German expressionist cinema, and it's also a dramatization of a medieval Jewish folktale. So it's a really cool piece of Jewish folklore as well. Film critic Leonard Maltin compared it to Frankenstein. And finally, we have a film called The Last Laugh. This was also directed by Murnau. It's the story of a hotel doorman, an elderly hotel doorman who basically is fired. They see him trying to carry a big foot locker off of a wagon one day, and it's so taxing to him that he actually sits down and nods off for a little bit. So the next day, the manager calls him into the office tells him he's fired, makes him turn in his uniform, and basically he's humiliated, and he tries to conceal his being fired. He even takes his uniform back, and he tries to conceal from his family and friends and neighbors that he was, was still working, or that he was fired. But eventually they find out, and it's a really nice analogy or an allegory about how Germany was at the time, having been brought low from losing a war and being defeated, being humiliated in the international scale. At the end, there's a happy ending for the doorman, but that's where all the similarities between this film and the German people end. This is a book for anybody that's interested in studying the Weimar Republic a little bit more, especially the pop cultural events. This is a good book to check out. And now we'll go back to stamps, and I call this From Pennies to Billions. These stamps on this page are all just numerals. They're all denominated in pennies. These stamps are really nice because they're kind of made in that exaggerated expressionist artistic style that I mentioned in the films. You can find these types of stamps on 2 different types of watermarks. And these are from the same album page. These are worker stamps, and these are also denominated in pennies from 60 to 160. A couple of the last issues of the Germania design are down here as well. That was the longest running. That issue ran from 1900 to 1922. So there's tons and tons and tons of them out there, and these were among the last couple issues. Now this is a different page of miners and farmers, and you might notice that they're not denominated in pennies anymore. They're denominated in marks. Goes from a 5 to a 50 mark. Some of these are really hard to find used. Like the 5 mark is hard to find used, and so is the 50. But to me, it's an interesting comparison when you put one of the early issue stamps next to one of the later ones. This page is also a good illustration of the hyperinflation, about what happened. There are two issues. I call these the ovals. The 5 and 10 mark aren't shown, but everything from the 50 all the way down to the 100,000 mark designs are shown. The 100,000 mark was the last issue of this one, and it was issued in August or September, I believe. But you can see just throughout the year of 1923 the progression of how much it costs to mail something. And this is also a good 1-page illustration of inflation spiraling out of control. There are a couple commemorative stamps on this page. There weren't very many commemoratives issued during the Weimar inflationary period, probably for obvious reasons. But this is a 5,000 mark, and that shows the Wartburg Castle, which is in Thuringia. And this is a 10,000 mark, and that shows the Cologne Cathedral. So actually, before I go on, if there are any other questions or comments, I'll stop. All right, well, we'll go on to late August. That's when things really started to get out of hand. Germany did 2 things, which are illustrated here. They began to overprint stocks of the older stamps, and they also began to overprint new values over old designs. And what I mean by that, here's the 30 penny, 30 Pfennig. Here's the 8,000 mark on a 30 Pfennig stamp. And here's a 4,000 mark on a 30 Pfennig stamp, but you can see it's a different color. and it's also a different perforation. You can see that on the 40, and the ones above here, you can see how they just took the old design, they printed it in a different color, and they overprinted it with a denomination. They did this with the farmer stamps, although it appears they just overprinted old stocks of the stamps that were no longer useful for postage. Same on this 100 mark stamp. And they used these 100 mark stamps pretty much for the rest of the time they were overprinting stamps from the 100 to the 5,000 mark. And as you can see, sometimes they just overprinted an old useless sheet of stamps, and sometimes they just printed the design in a different color. So this is definitely my favorite way of grouping these and displaying these types of stamps, because you can kind of see how the overprints progressed. And this is a page of the final inflationary period stamps. The value up here is 5,000. The value down here is 50 billion with a B. And these were all printed within probably between like mid to late September, and the end of November. And this page also shows that they can come in two varieties. The ones up top are regular perforations, and the ones down at the bottom of the stamp are rouletted. This 50 milliarden stamp, 50 billion stamp, is probably it's definitely one of the most valuable ones used. If you can find this one used, you're in luck. And if you can find it on cover, you got a really treasured item, because they were in use for so short a time that there just weren't very many of them used. And this is the final set of overprints, and these are stamps that are already denominated in the millions, redenominated into billions. So the hyperinflation ended in December 1923. There was a new currency that was created based on the value of land in Germany. It was pretty much what was in force until the war. And this is an example, one of the more affordable examples of a Rentenmark banknote. Now, this is a stamp calendar. I like keeping calendars, and since I have so many German stamps, I've taken the audacious step of trying to do them just by year. And this is my page for November 1923. You can see almost all of them are either million or billion stamps. I did make a mistake on here. If anybody has any eagle eyes and wants to point out where the date that my mistake is, you can let me know. It's tough to see, I know. It's in December 8th. This is a 3 mark. I think it's a 3 mark post horn stamp. And after I had already finalized the presentation, I was going through it. I was like, that can't be right. So I went back to my calendar, and sure enough, this stamp was actually canceled in November 8th, 1922. So this is what a postal rate would have been in 1922. There's no way you could have gotten enough of these stamps on a envelope in November 1923 to legitimately mailed it. And here's another, it's a lower value. It's only in the thousands, but I'll show you later that people just wanted to use up their old stamps, so they put as many as they could on a cover. This is my page for December so far. You can see, oh wait, I wanted to make a point before I went on. From November 26th to the 30th, all the stamps were worth 4 times their face value. So like when this 2 billion mark stamp was mailed on the 30th, it was actually worth 8 billion. And this was because by this time, the German government decided that they were going to switch currencies in December. They didn't want to print any more stamps, but they also had a lot of, you know, leftover stamps they needed to use. So if you went to the post office on the 26th and bought stamps, you would have paid 8 billion marks for this 2 billion stamp, but it would have been valid for postage. But one of the nice things, and I kind of think of this as a very early forerunner of like a forever stamp or something. If you already had like 2 billion mark stamps that you already used and you used them to mail a letter during this time, they were worth 8 billion, because obviously they couldn't tell that you purchased them before this time, so they just let that slide. So I don't know what kind of a savings it would have been, but you definitely could have saved a little money if you had some extra stamps laying around. So, and here's my calendar page from 1923. Again, for those with eagle eyes, I don't know how well you can see this, but the stamps look the same, but a lot of them just have numerals on them, and those are numerals in the Renton penny. So, like this is a 10 cent. They did allow stamps, the old stamps, to be used during this period. So you'll see 10 billion mark stamps. You'll see, this 5,000 mark stamps. I don't know how this could have been legitimately used on December 30th, but somebody was able to use it. You'll see them because the old stamps were worth 1 billionth with a B of their face value. And they were worth that through December of 1923, although they continue to allow their usage. So you can actually find inflation stamps with 1924 cancels on them. They're not common, but you can find them. So hyperinflation did spread throughout the eastern part of Europe. This is a page of stamps from Austria from 1922. And I call this the inflation definitive series. That's not its official name, but this is basically the stamps that they used throughout that period. This is a half krone up here. The bottom of the page, there's a 500 kronen stamp, and it just kept going throughout the year. This is at the bottom is a 2,000 kronen stamp. They issued a lot of different types of stamps. They're all the same design, but they have different denominations. This is the final page of that series that I have. As you can see, there's a 10,000 kronen stamp here, and it was issued in 1924. Australia, their inflation didn't get as bad, in quotes. Like, they weren't denominating things in the millions, but they were actually having problems with it well into 1924, where Germany had already changed their currency. A big problem, going back to the Austria-Hungary point, Vienna was a mess because a lot of people in that city worked in civil service to help administer the affairs of the empire and things like that. So basically, when the Austrian Empire was broken up, their services were no longer needed, and a lot of them were thrown out of work. So you had a lot of unemployed people, and you also had a lot of retirees who worked civil service all their life, who were basically at the mercy of the goodwill of whatever the government or their neighbors could provide. Because, if you received I don't know what a krone was worth back then, but let's say you received a 500 krone a month pension, that wasn't going to change. And I don't know if it did. They could have probably changed it through legislation or whatever, but I don't remember if it did or not. So there were a lot of people, especially the elderly and the infirmed, who were hurting at that time. So this is an example of one of their banknotes, and no matter how bad things got in Austria, their currency was always beautiful. And here's an example of a banknote from Hungary. The banknote and the stamp are the same denomination. It also has basically the same illustration on it as well. but the 10,000 Corona stamp was the highest stamp that they issued in Hungary at the time. Here are some stamps from Poland. Poland got into overprinting old issues. This one is the middle one is a 10,000 in words. At the bottom are some kind of newer designs that were easy to change the denomination on. And I do believe that 2,000 or 2 million marks was the highest denomination that their stamps got to. They had some pretty highly denominated banknotes too. Any questions to this point before I move on to the next area that I want to tell you about?
Scott, what was the year on those?
The stamps.
Yeah, the Polish stamps down here.
I think the bottom ones are from 1924. I would have to double check those for you, Dick.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks.
Yeah, like Austria, Poland had a. I don't think Poland changed currencies until 1925. And I don't, unlike the German and the Austria stamps, the only catalog I have for them is the Scott. So I usually don't pull those big volumes out very often. But thank you for the question. I thought next, since there's probably some people in the audience that like to do the fly specking and the checking of perforations and printing varieties and things like that. I thought I'd throw out a few ideas for specializing. This is a screen grab from a really great website. It's called the World Stamp Project. If you're not familiar with it, check it out. It's not just Germany. There's pretty much issues from all over the world. They have a really good content on there for different varieties. And this is just an example of one of their plate flaw varieties. There's a stamp up top that they call the the man with the feather. Here's an enlargement of it. You can see the farmer on his hat here has a feather, but the guy working behind him, that shouldn't be there. It's just some kind of plate flaw or a printing flaw. So I haven't been able to go through my 10 mark stamps to look for this guy, but when I have the time, maybe earlier next year, I will. A lot of times they'll tell you how common it is, but this one, it really doesn't give you an idea. Now this flaw is very common, which is why I'm showing it to you. If you have maybe 100 or 200 of this issue of stamps, either, different denominations or the same denomination, you might be able to find a few of these. It's called the broken rosette. It happens, there's a close-up of it here. It happens over here on this side of the stamp. They occur in every hyperinflation denomination, except the 2 million and the 30 million. I don't know why they don't occur on those. They just don't. But I looked through them all of my stock, and I found literally dozens of them. So they're probably not even worth a whole lot of a premium because most people probably don't even look for them. But if you really like to get into specialization, you can actually look at where the break is and how it appears, because there are types that it's broken down based on how the break appears. And this is also from the World Stamp Project. The Michael catalog people also make a plate flaw catalog, but I probably will end up getting it sometime. But since it's in German, this is probably more useful for me anyway, because I don't read German. I can get by enough to use the catalog, but when you're looking at specialized things, it's really hard to follow sometimes. And here's a close-up of the broken rosette. It's right here on the stamp. And there are several other different types of this stamp that don't have anything to do with the broken rosette. So postal history is also a popular way to collect inflation stamps. Our good friend Dick Kohlberg got me this pamphlet when he was at the APS several years ago. It's what I used as a reference for the postal rates. So like I said, some of the rates were only used for a matter of days. So trying to collect them all in 1923, for example, would definitely be a worthy challenge. And the Michael Specialized Catalog also has the tables of the rates, but again, it's all in German, so it's really hard to get through it at some points, while this is all in English. And I did want to note too, back on slides 42 and 43, when I was explaining those special rates they had at the end of November, that all came from this pamphlet here from the Germany Philatelic Society Study Group. And this is my favorite cover. It didn't cost a lot, probably because you can't really see any details about where it was canceled or anything. So this wouldn't be something that you could necessarily put in an exhibit of rates. However, I love it because it just shows the colorfulness of the stamps and the different varieties that were in circulation at the time. There are generally about 200 different varieties, of both denomination and design, just generally in the period. So you could spend your whole life just looking through them, looking for things. Here's an example of one of those covers I mentioned that are just plastered with stamps because people were just trying to use them. This was mailed on, I do have the information on the front of the cover. It was mailed on September 5th, 1923. I should have noted whether or not there were stamps on the front. I don't think there were, but as you can see, it took a lot of 200 mark stamps to send it. Here's a postcard. It took 10 billion marks to mail, and I believe it looks like it was mailed on the 21st, which would have been the correct rate for that time. If it would have been mailed, November only has 30 days, so, but if this would have been mailed on November 30th, it still would have had a 10 billion mark stamp on it. But during that time, the 10 billion mark stamp would have actually been worth 40. Here's a screenshot, and you can see the address for the World Stamp Project. Collecting sheets and blocks. I have several sheets, and I like collecting the stamp that has the Oberand on it or the margin information. It's a lot of fun, and since the stamps are so common, it makes it a little bit more interesting if you can show one that was part of a sheet. It's surprisingly inexpensive to collect them this way. But one of the things I always wondered was, since they became obsolete so quickly, why were there so many of them around? Obviously, if there were stamps left over that people couldn't use, that would have explained it. But I didn't really think it explained why there's such an excessive quantity of them. But I have a theory. And again, this should be taken with a grain of salt because it hasn't been tested or peer reviewed or anything. But I found this cover. It was addressed to someone in America from a German stamp dealer named Paul Schwertner. This was from February of 1923, and it has 190 marks worth of inflation stamps on the front of it. There aren't any on the back. And I recognize the name because Mr. Schwertner's name is also found in the margins of a lot of the later inflation stamps. And the notice on it is translated. I use Google to translate it. Paul R. Schwertner, Berlin, purchase of collections and antiquated stocks in any amount, World Trading House for stamps. So there was and still is a lot of worldwide interest in the novelty of owning stamps that were, this crazy, denomination wise. They've always been found in beginners packets, and they continue to be available in great quantity. And my theory is this dealer may have been working with the German authorities to mass produce them and sell them on the world market because they needed some. It would have been another way to bring foreign currency in. to a
Scott,
country.
can you go back 2 slides?
Yep.
It's interesting to note the second pair, which are 1,000. I believe the sheets were printed in were sheets of 100, so it would be 10 by 10. So the 10,000 would be 10 of the first column, and then if you got 2 columns, it's 20,000. It goes across till you get to 100,000.
Yes. Yeah, they did. They even do this nowadays. I think they print the denomination if a clerk was going to sell a whole row of them. And
Yeah.
that's another reason why. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that's another reason why I like having them, because some of the like this Oberrand with the lines. This actually the vertical lines indicate it was printed on a rotary press. If they don't have the lines, it indicates it was printed on a flat plate. So for the sake of time, I didn't want to get too far into the weeds, but
Right.
for the ones that were overprinted, if you have a full sheet of stamps, you can tell, or at least narrow down to a few post offices where it was actually printed based on how the this part of the sheet and this part of the sheet, and in one case the bottom of the sheet was overprinted.
Yeah. It also lets you know where the pair is in relation to the sheet.
Yes, it does.
Hey, Scott,
Yes.
if somebody were interested in picking up stamps with those marginal inscriptions, I suspect that the circuit books at the APS stamp sales would be a great source for that.
Yes, thank you, Dick. They're not commonly found with those. There was a guy in Florida. He's still selling stamps. He looks like he just breaks up sheets, and I was buying stamps from him 4 or 5 years ago. He's still selling them, so he must have had sea chests full of them. But yeah, he'd tear like the first 4 or 5 in a row off of a top of a sheet and sell them that way, and that's where I ended up getting a lot of them. But I'm gonna start checking out the circuit books for when I get back into doing my calendars again for nice dated postmarks and things like that.
Scott,
Yes, George.
go back 1 slide. Go another one to the 200.
Yes.
I thought I had a real prize here. I have one that's lightly hinged of 200. How many million?
These are 200 mark, these ones.
200. And I'm disappointed it's not worth very much, is it?
No. Well, I made the comment last night. If you remember back where that I showed that bond on the slide, there are people on eBay actually trying to sell those old German bonds for hundreds, in some cases thousands of dollars, and I don't think it's because they're that rare. And I don't know if they're trying to find a sucker who thinks that they're going to be worth that much again in the future. But it's a dead currency, so you know, they're neat to have as a curiosity. But I think I got about 3 of those 100,000 mark bonds for like $30.
Yeah, I thought I was doing good because I had a 200, a 500, a 1,000,
Wow.
2,000, and a 3,000. And they're worth about, the interesting thing is the watermark on them.
Yes.
When you turn them over, it's very obvious. You don't need any watermark detection fluid.
That's one of the nice things about the German stamps. They usually do have a strong watermark on them. And there's really only 2 different kinds. I think this 200 mark, for example, you can find it with the lozenge watermark and the network watermark. And the lozenge is just kind of a triangle, and they're just triangles floating in the paper, and the watermark looks like chicken wire.
Yes.
Or I'm sorry, the network looks like chicken wire. So yeah, I'll trade you a 50 billion mark for those.
They're coming your way.
Oh, thanks, George. So yeah, I have a lot of fun with these stamps. To kind of wrap up the presentation, I'm almost done. If there's one book that I could recommend to somebody or to anybody that wants to learn more about this period, it's this one. It's called When Money Dies. It's just full of anecdotes. Unfortunately, I misplaced my copy, so I wasn't really able to review it before this presentation. And I had an extra copy, but I sold it at one of our PSLC auctions. But anyway, there's a lot of information in here from Germany and from Austria and other. I think it's mostly Germany and Austria, but the whole region was struggling with it. And there's an interesting note about this cover. If you look closely at the picture, those aren't German banknotes being swept to the curb. They're actually from Hungary in 1946. Because they had a really, really terrible inflation after the war. This is the website that I would recommend. Actually, shortly after I started collecting inflation issues and started Googling around the internet trying to find information about them, I found this website. And if you're interested in Europe and North America, this is an incredible website. I mean, I'm sure if you're well versed in a lot of the areas, you could probably learn a few things from it, and if not, you can learn about new areas. This is the Weimar Republic section, and you see how it's broken down. It's not comprehensive. It doesn't show you every issue, but for example, this is where I got the idea to compare the workers when they were denominated in pennies and when they were denominated in marks. So it's stampcollectingworld.com. This is a Michael catalog. I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody that collects German stamps that the Michael catalog is probably the best reference. I like how they number them because they don't break them up into subcategories like Scott does. There is no back of the book per se. They only separate their official stamps from their regular use stamps, but it doesn't matter if it was an airmail or a semi-postal, it'll be in chronological order. So Michael number 1 through Michael 910 basically represents every issue of Germany from 1872 even through 1945 after the war was over, because some of the earlier issues were actually cataloged after 910 in order. But the one I have it illustrated here is an English language small catalog just showing the German Reich. It's not specialized or anything, but it's a really good reference for the period between 1872 and 1945. Michael, used Michael German catalogs aren't hard to find. They do have an English language version. I think the latest one they made was about 5 years ago, and I was lucky to find a couple of them on Amazon for a lot less than they go for, but they aren't cheap. And another good reference for anybody that's interested in starting out in German, starting to collect Germany, is this junior catalog. It is in Germany, but my first Michael catalog was a junior catalog. I got it off of eBay. It was the cheapest one I could find, and I didn't think it would come, but probably about 2 months after I ordered it, it arrived from Germany. Now I buy my catalogs on Nordfirm. They have really good prices for the catalogs, and I'm sure you guys all have nice or favorite stamp dealers where you can find your catalogs. But this is the one to go to for Germany. And I will close by some other suggestions for hyperinflation, and I use banknotes to illustrate them. This is a note from Greece, 10,000 drachma. I actually got one of these at the coin shop in Lebanon when I was in probably 2nd or 3rd grade, and I took it to school, to impress all my friends, and they were like, "He has $10,000." Well, not really, but the Greek notes got really high. I think they got into the millions, and they're not hard to find. The the box of notes that the coin dealer had, the stamp and coin dealer had, were probably ones that were brought back during World War II. But there were a lot of countries in World War II that suffered from the inflation because of the situation. And oh yeah, I noted that this might be the reason why I got so fascinated in inflation to begin with, is from this note. This is a Hungary note, and Hungary notes aren't as fun to collect because they're not English, but I'm pretty sure I translated it right. This is a 1 sextillion pengo note. Like wherever I got this information, they didn't have it. It was like a table, and it wasn't in words. It was like numbers with exponents. That's how bad it got there. There was a note higher than this, but they didn't ever have to issue it. You can find specimens of it, but this is the highest Hungary note. And oops, the one below it, Latin America frequently struggles with hyperinflation, and this is a 1 million peso note from Argentina from the 70s. When the Iron Curtain fell, that also caused problems in Eastern Europe. The top note is from Yugoslavia, and the bottom note is actually from Poland from 1992. They were back to 2 million 2 million denomination notes at that time.
Lucky.
Yep. So, and this is a pretty well-known one now, and this is very recent, a $100 trillion note from Zimbabwe. I've heard stories, I think I saw them in news reports, that the government used to send people out into the streets with suitcases full of these notes to try to sell them for foreign currency. I also heard that, back, 10, 15 years ago, after it first happened, you couldn't give these away for a quarter. People just weren't interested in them. But now they can sell for over $100 on eBay, and I wouldn't buy them from just anybody because I'm sure there's a lot of counterfeits out there. And below it, since we're talking about stamps, I did find an image of some high denominated stamps. I don't have any yet because they're surprisingly expensive. I think on eBay they're asking about $10 for one of these blocks. So to close, collecting hyperinflation as a historical memorial. This is called a memorial sheet that was presented in Germany from 5 pennies to 1,000,000,000 marks. And this part here translated says, "May this time never again return to the fatherland." And this period inflicted a lot of trauma on people, both on the Germans, and as well as the Germans inflicted a lot of trauma on other people to get to this part. So it's good to kind of remember it, but not take it out of context. Not worry it's gonna happen again necessarily. It could happen, and it is happening in different places, but there's reasons behind it. And that's the subject of my last slide here. This is a quote from On a Note of Triumph, which was a radio show that was broadcast on the day that we declared victory in Europe. We've learned out of World War II that we'd learned nothing out of World War I. And this was a response to a GI asking, what have we learned, from our experience? Because the whole show was basically told from the standpoint of a GI asking questions, what happened, what happens next, what's going to happen in the future. And I remember in 6th grade, somehow we got on the discussion of Japan, and I asked my teacher, why do we spend so much money to rebuild Japan? And after we just spent fighting a war with them, and I don't remember what exact response was, but the gist of it was, so it doesn't happen again. So I want to thank everybody for listening to my presentation. I've thought about it for the whole year. I may have spent a month and a half putting it together, and I still left a lot of stuff out, but I hope, and I probably made a lot of mistakes too that I didn't catch, but I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thank you.